Well, you have two historical novels about China. Is that right?
One historical. The other one was actually contemporary as I could make it.
Oh, okay.
So Drink and Dream Teahouse was set in, I wrote in 98, and it was set in 97. So, and then I went to historical.
And now that you're living in Hong Kong, you've written about...
I write about places I'm not in. So now I'm in Hong Kong, I'm writing about England. So I think nostalgia for a place must be something that kind of excites me or gets me to write.
Yeah, it's not even really England, though, is it? It's Anglo-Saxon England. It's a pretty different place.
Yeah, in the book I use the Anglo-Saxon names, and one of the reasons I did that was because I wanted to, so it didn't feel like England, because although the geography is the same, actually it is quite a different country. And if I was talking, say, about Nottingham, or Manchester, I didn't want you to think of Manchester or Nottingham, or even Manchester United. I wanted you to think of these are kind of strange places. Yeah, it is a foreign world. It passes, a foreign country.
Can you actually pronounce the names of, like, London is not London. London is...
Yeah, Londonburg. And most of them are actually fairly similar. Contone, Londonburg. Some of them almost exactly the same, like Winchester. It's interesting because in this period, England is slightly different. The capital is not London, even though London's the biggest city. So, yeah.
I think you'd better start with an outline of the story.
Well, originally, I was looking at doing a novel about 1066, and for those of you who don't know, 1066 is the last time England was conquered. And they're conquered by the Norman French who come over in the Battle of Hastings, and the King of England, a man called Harold, gets an arrow in his eye, and that's kind of that's the end of kind of England's links with the Germanic world, and it kind of gets pulled towards sort of southern Europe. Looking at that story, I realized actually 50 years before that, in 1016, there's another conquest, the sort of second to last time England was conquered, which is the Danish conquest, which is an Englishman I'd never really heard about. And the interesting thing, I guess, is the father of the man who gets the arrow in his eye is very caught up in these events, and he rises to power from being a kind of nobody, really, to being the most powerful man in the kingdom. And so I thought, well, to tell the story of 1066, I want to go back and tell the story of his father and what happened in the kind of the Danish conquest 50 years before that. So that's what this book is about, is telling that story.
There's great names. Wulfnoth, is that Godwin's father?
You can see the kind of changes that happen in England after this period, because, we have, Wulfnoth means kind of fighting wolf. And so you have these fabulous names that we don't have in English anymore, because we have names like William and Henry, which are all French names, and that's because of the Battle of Hastings. Whereas in Germany, you still have them, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I met a guy from Norway last week called Thor, who's the Norwegian god of thunder. He has a big red beard and a big hammer. And I thought, well, such a better name than Justin even. Justin? I kind of like these old Germanic names.
Yeah, Ethelred. I'm partial to Ethelred.
Yeah.
I like Ethelred. It's a good name.
Yeah, I had a son born 4 months ago, and I named him Edmund, which is a very good old English king's name.
Not Ethelred.
Not Ethelred, no.
No, that's probably a bit cruel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Why don't you read a bit? I think it's hard to get the feeling. We have the sound effects, as you've noticed next door. There's a lot of sort of banging in Anglo-Saxon England.
Yeah, I think the Vikings are at the door.
You're right, and they're sort of burning something down and cleaving people with battle axes. So that'll give you some additional flavor of the book.
So hopefully they'll start on cue and start banging again.
There we go, see?
One thing that I thought was very interesting is kind of Europe is not Europe as we know it in this period. And so Dublin, obviously now is the capital of Ireland, but in that period it was a Viking kind of slave town. And so I wanted the story to start in Dublin. So it starts in Dublin, midwinter 1013. And I'll read from the beginning. 1013, as you'll notice, was almost 1,000 years ago. And if you think back to the Y2K kind of hysteria of the world would end, our computers would crash, our digital watches would stop working, how would we toast bread in the morning? There was a similar kind of feeling in Europe at this point as well, because it was 1,000 years since Christ's birth. So Dublin, midwinter, 1013. Christ did not come again that year. The Lord kept his churches and the pages of his book, and Wulfnoth sat in the half-timbered hall, watching rain drip down through roof thatch, puddling on the floor, while the peat fire smoked. His remaining men sat round him, the wooden benches drawn close, cloaks and hoods pulled tight to their chests. Their round boss shields hung in the hall shadows. Their spears were sheathed, their swords kept to hand, like favourite hounds. The midwinter days were short and dark. Thin shadows stretched long on the ground. No one spoke. It was bad business these days in Dublin. The slave markets were still busy, but day by day rumour grew of the size of Brian Borough's war host. War was coming, like a mounted horseman. A blood-red horse, the Lord's book said, hell and judgment following after. The seagulls sensed it, that distant scent of battle. They fought and cawed in chaotic multitudes, swooped low over small fishing boats, plucked cold, flapping fish from the slate-grey waters. The dull winter day was cold and grey and bleak. Wulfnoth stood at the quayside and looked out towards the estuary. He watched the masts of approaching warships appear among the riverside trees, the rain unceasing as it stripped the bows, wet leaves plastered along the smooth river water. Wulfnoth shivered, despite his blue cloak and hood, the shaggy lining beginning to wear thin. The silver brooch held the wool cloth close to his chest, the disc patterned with 3 swirling hounds. The midwinter days were short, and the afternoon light was already beginning to fail. The hound's blue glass eyes were dull, one eye setting blind and empty. Wulfnoth stood still as an ancient oak, gnarled and hollowed by too many winters, staring eastwards over the waves. His thoughts were far away from this muddy dockside, in the shadow of the high Dublin earthworks, topped with a wall of split timber. They crossed the grey and restless waves, made their way back to the fields of his youth, to his hall's hearthside, where warm and gentle hands welcomed his return, when there was good food on the table, when warm-hearted words and music and laughter rose like Abbey Plain chant, when he slept without cares under home rafters and a heavy thatch. So that's the beginning of the story. Starts in Dublin, and Wulfnoth is actually the father of Godwin, and Godwin is the kind of hero of this story, the father of the man who gets killed at Battle of Hastings. And what struck me actually in this period is, and one of the reasons I really wanted to kind of write a series of books that try to kind of encompass it all, is that all the nations of Britain have very seminal figures in this period. In Ireland, you have Brian Boru, who's the first man to unite the Irish kingdoms. In Scotland, you have Macbeth, and the whole Shakespeare cast, Kenneth Duncan, Macduff, Earl Seward. In England, you have Ethelred Reddy, Canute, William the Conqueror, Harold Godwinson, all these names. In Wales, you have some Llewellyn princes. And I thought, it seems to me that as the United Kingdom carries on its kind of long fragmentation, that actually how interesting to cover this period of history when all the nations of Britain, Scots, English, Welsh and Irish, have kind of seminal figures in their history. And actually one of the reasons that Harold loses at Hastings is because of Macbeth, which I thought was a fabulous story. And in Shakespeare, Earl Seward's a good Englishman, whereas actually he's a Norwegian Viking who comes over with Canute. And so I guess all this stuff it seems very relevant to Britain now, and very interesting to kind of tease it out and see what is myth and what is the actual, I guess, closer to the truth.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to live then? I mean, it's in the book. You talk about, their manor houses and castles, but they're wouldn't quite be recognizable as such. These are relatively small and humble.
We were talking about kind of archaeologically. I mean, if you're writing about the Romans, it's so much easier because not only is there more written material, but even archaeologically, there's far more stuff that survives because the Romans were using glass or they were using metal much more, or their earthenware pots were much better preserved. The Anglo-Saxons built houses out of wood, and they use leather a lot, and their pots kind of disintegrate. So it was quite difficult finding out the kind of the basics of the kind of the world they lived in. And one way of researching it is looking at their literature. But the problem, I don't know how many people have read any Anglo-Saxon literature in translation. Even their poems are what survive the most, and their poems are all they're kind of religious poems, and they're all about kind of midwinter, cold, snow, loneliness. They're all about the bad things in life, about the loss of warmth and the loss of heat. And I found it very tough, kind of trying to imagine their world, because I thought, I can't write a book where it happens in midwinter all year long. It's snowing all year, and people are miserable. And I was writing in residence at Lingnan University, and I was just kind of walking through the English department library, and I saw a book from the 1950s called The Lost Literature of Medieval England. And it was printed in 1954, and the last time it had been taken out, I think, was in 1962. And I took the book out, and this was fabulous because it was a book about books that we know existed from catalogues of libraries, and it also had a lot of translations of Latin Old English texts. Because English is quite interesting because it's probably the only country that has such a kind of a large body of native language literature to survive from the year sort of 500 onwards. And what was interesting about the Latin texts is often they were lives of saints, or they were material about how saints came to the wilderness, and and the crops grew, and the chickens laid eggs, and the pigs grew fat. And so this was fabulous because it gave me a completely different kind of view from their own sources, kind of into their world, and how they described the kind of the world they lived in, and their kind of aspirations. So that was perfect because the Old English poems gave me midwinter, and the religious texts gave me summer. And then, kind of archaeologically, there's all kinds of material. And I think one of the challenges of writing historical fiction is, I guess good historical fiction is to capture the world and to capture the kind of living conditions of the people. And you end up, I remember there was an excavation of a hearth, so kind of a cooking fire. And the excavators kind of had worked out from different material they found, kind of which straw they used for kindling, which straw they used for actually faggots for burning and cooking food. And of course, they would know the difference between barley straw or wheat straw or rye straw. And so you end up kind of knowing this kind of detail, which actually, if you put into a book, would be so boring, it would be impossible to read. So you end up kind of learning this material and then never really using it. Or if you ever use it, it gets a kind of brief mention in a sentence, very obliquely. And you've got rye straw as kindling, but no one else will.
Wolfnoth and Godwin basically run southern England, isn't that?
Yeah, so characters, again, there's a lot of kind of guesswork about this period. In England, we have this book called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is written by monks, so written by the church, and it's basically a kind of religious chronicle of events that happen. And it's written after the events, maybe 20 or 30 years. So often they're kind of explaining why things happened. So if a king is bad and ends up getting killed in battle, they'll talk about his mistresses, or how he stole money from the church, and so then God punished him by killing him in battle. And so a lot of the challenges for Shieldwall was fixing. We know certain people were at certain events and did certain things, and I guess the challenge for the historical novelist is kind of creating the characters who do these things in real life, and kind of moving them around and making. I think where historical fiction has a real contribution to history is it views history through the characters' points of view, often in a way history books don't. History books can often be about facts. And I remember reading a book called The Sun in Splendor by Sharon Penman, which is about the Wars of the Roses, so kind of Richard III in that period, just before the Tudors come to power. And I was very interested in this period as a child, and it wasn't until I read this historical novel that I realized that I really didn't know the period at all, because if you didn't know Richard III was the cousin of Warwick the Kingmaker, and that their relationships, the relationships with their fathers, blah, 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 all their kind of family circumstances, how they grew up, you really missed out on the characters' motivations and who they were as people. And I thought, this is where historical novels can do a great job. And this is actually where I had the first idea to kind of write historically. Entering stories that we know through history books, through the characters who were involved in those stories. And I think that gives you another kind of dimension onto the history.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of knew most of the people. I learned about them in school, and combined with the movies, you have these visions of people in gleaming armor and castles with flags flying, and it wasn't quite like that, was it? I mean, there are a couple scenes in Godwin's hall, which is burned down, and they rebuild it. How big would it have been, really, compared to the size of this room, for example?
Yeah, they kind of an average house clearly would be much smaller, but from excavations that archaeologists have done, they've found Viking or English halls probably about twice the length of this room. Really quite enormous buildings. Where I live in Yorkshire, in north of England, we have kind of traditional houses called Yorkshire longhouses, which I think are just kind of a continuation of Viking houses. So probably the width of this room, and one half would be where you kept your livestock, and the other half would be where the people lived. And so this was kind of the average dwelling. But kind of the king's halls were really, quite substantial buildings, and also they're also starting to build in stone again. So kind of, if you imagine a Viking city, actually you have a lot of Roman remains. The last Roman buildings that we know mentioned in London, for example, are still around in the 1500s. So you'd have a kind of quite odd combination of Roman buildings still standing with kind of Viking wooden houses with thatched roofs kind of mixed in. And so, kind of very interesting kind of how it must have been for them, these people who didn't know how to build in stone, sort of seeing these buildings. And then, of course, churches. I mean, we have surprised. I mean, actually, having written the book, I was surprised how many places you can still go back and walk in the footsteps of people. So I was back in England last month, and there's a place called Bosham on the Solent, on the south coast of England, with a church that was built by Godwin. I found that many of these places, these churches, are still in England. And so this was kind of quite exciting for me, being here and kind of thinking, actually, you can go to England and you can walk in the places where these kings walked. Because for English people, the pre-Norman period is a semi-mythical past. We date our kings from William the Conqueror. So we have, William the First. Edward I, who comes a couple of generations after him, he's actually about Edward VII, because there's been so many Anglo-Saxon kings. But the Normans did such a kind of brain job on the English that we just forget all these Anglo-Saxon kings, Anglo-Saxon history. So it was quite amazing for me as an Englishman to kind of think, wow, there are places, there's buildings that these men built that you can still go back and walk, in the exact same footsteps, which seems quite magical to me.
That's fine. I reading the book, I started to look up on Wikipedia, something like Svein Forkbeard, which is a great name. He was king for about 6 months or something like that. And so this either means, and it agreed with the book, which either means that the book's correct, it means you used Wikipedia when you were writing the book, or it means that you edited Wikipedia after you wrote the book, so it would agree with what you'd written.
Actually. Wikipedia is a great kind of, entrance in. But really there's I wrote this book in Hong Kong, and it's about Dark Age England, and it was about places in England I've never been to. And funnily, I was being interviewed by Discovery Bay magazine, and the guy interviewing me saying, at the end we had like a 2-hour chat, and at the end he said, is the village that takes place Compton in West Sussex? And I said, yeah, it's next to Up Marsden and Down Marsden. And he said, my lesbian aunt lives in Compton. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yes. He said, you got the village very right. And I said, I'm so glad you said that, because I've never been. But I use Google Earth, and I use Google Earth to trace, if I was having a character walk from one village to the next, you can trace on Google Earth the paths, and it tells you to the foot the altitude of where you're walking. So I knew if characters were walking uphill or downhill, and I knew if you were kind of looking out from a building, you were looking over a slope going downwards, or, all this kind of stuff. It was fabulous, and Wikipedia is a help, but there's, I guess so much more is the kind of archaeological information that you can find now. So many journals are online, all these PDFs I could download and read. So actually, I don't think I could have written the book in the way I did from Hong Kong without the internet, and certainly without Google Earth. So thank you, Google.
How much is true? How much do you know is true? How much is true enough or illuminatingly true? When you write historical fiction, how much of it, or put it another way, what can one learn from reading historical fiction that you don't get from just reading history, and how true is that?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question of, historical fiction is not a historical, kind of textbook. You wouldn't pass an exam necessarily, reading, Shieldwall. But, and I think this is kind of the novelist's question, is how close to the facts do you keep? And I've read a book by Bernard Cornwell, who, is a very well-known historical novelist. And at the back of one of his books, he said, I keep to the facts, apart from this battle happened in a different year, but I wanted my character to be at both battles, so I moved it. And that kind of, that spoiled the book for me. I thought, I feel, I didn't like that. And so I think often writers, you're writing the book for yourself. You are the first audience. You have to get up every morning and, not watch TV or not talk to your wife or not talk to the children and sit alone in a room and write a book. And so if you're not enjoying it, if you're not interested, then you almost can't expect the audience to, the reader to be. And so I really set myself the kind of task of writing as close to history as possible, which makes it a bit difficult, especially with this period. So I was talking a bit earlier. The main characters are real people, and we know when they died. We can guess when they were born from the ages they get married, or this kind of thing, or the ages their names start to be recorded. But a lot of stuff we don't know. We don't know why people did things often. And so this book, I think, is quite close to the truth, because you can bring a knowledge of a period and make guesses at why people did things. Thinking about their law codes, their honor codes, their family relationships. And there was a book by a fabulous historian from York who died, a guy called Richard Fletcher, Blood Feud, where he was bringing kind of a historian's knowledge to kind of this story of a blood feud from this period. And it was kind of like a detective story, because people's names would pop up in various sources and people would kill another person and kind of vice versa. And he was trying to work out what the story was, and it really is kind of detective work. And so I was basing my, kind of my research on people like him, who bring a very kind of close knowledge of the period, and the kind of the society, and because England had quite a sophisticated law system at this period, but you also had the blood feud. So if someone killed your brother, you could go and then kill them, and then of course their family would kill you because you killed them. It gets, it kind of goes on like this. So all this kind of stuff you can bring to the period and work out what is true. But the basic facts, the people, I guess the people, the events are all true. And as a novelist, you try and shed light on the characters and why they did things and why their stories can end up as they are.
Because there's one of the other characters is King Ethelred, who has this unfortunate nickname, I suppose it is, Ethelred the Unready, which is how I knew of him.
Yeah,
and he dithered apparently for decades about what to do about the Vikings, and ended up basically losing the whole country, didn't he?
Yeah, they have fabulous nicknames from this period. They didn't kind of call their kings first or second. They often called them by nicknames, and so you have Ethelred the Unready. You have Svein Forkbeard. Another great one is Ralph the Timid, which is a great kind of comment on his kind of warlikeness. So Ethelred the Unready is kind of one of the worst kings in English history. And there was a movement recently for historians to kind of resurrect him and say he wasn't so bad. But actually, I think kind of the events in this story, his son takes over. His father's Ethelred the Unready. His son is called Edmund Ironside. So even from the kind of the two nicknames, you know that there's a real difference between these two characters. And so, yeah, sorry, I was going off on nicknames. Yeah.
I think we'll open it up for questions in a minute, but maybe read a bit more and give people another bit of flavor of the thing.
Something I really wanted to bring into the language. My earlier books really have been about China, and I've speaking some Mandarin Chinese. I really wanted to bring the kind of language has its kind of rhythms and everything else, but I also wanted to kind of bring the mindset of Chinese into my English. And I was delighted when a few reviewers, including some native Chinese speaker reviewers, said it felt like the book had been translated from Chinese into English, which I thought was one of the best compliments. And so with this book, I wanted to do something quite similar. And so I really wanted to kind of bring the rhythms of Old English into my English, my modern English. And I'm going to read a bit from much later on in the book. I mean, this is quite different for me. There's a lot more action in this book. I mean, you have 6 battles happen in the space of a year, and this is actually the last one, where Godwin, who's the son of Wulfnoth, has become a kind of veteran, and so he's moved from the back lines of the battle to kind of the front line, and this is him going into battle for the last time. Godwin did not like the long wait, no more than he had when he was a defender. Come on, let's get this bastard battle over with, he thought to himself. But Edmund paused for the monks to sing a psalm, the one they had sung when Godwin was a boy. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. When the singing was over, Godwin stood at the front of the English and looked up at the Danes, who took the crest of the low slopes. They were tall and well dressed, and did not look afraid. They looked eager for battle. The sight was sobering. Do not parry with the sword. Sword on sword will ruin a blade. Do not watch the enemy's blade. Watch his body and wait for an opening. Godwin needed to piss again, but there was no time. He took his place at the front of the line, and they moved forward, and Godwin felt the field slope upwards. The army waited, a line of painted shields quartered with red and white, blue and green, black and yellow. Some were decorated with crosses, the bosses gleamed, the edges of axes and spears and swords had been freshly whetted. They gleamed with a cold white light. The Danes were silent till Edmund dressed the English lines one final time, and then led them forward at a slow walking pace. The army winded their war horns, hurled smooth, round estuary stones, and roared their war cries. The English replied enthusiastically. By the horns of hell, Godwin thought, as Edmund led them forward into the hail of deadly darts. Hell, 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 he thought, as each step brought the Danes closer. He could now make out faces amongst the massive shields, and lined himself up. When they were 3 spear lengths apart, Godwin could smell the sweat and the fear, and he could see the features that made each Dane distinctive from the next. When he was clear which man he would face, Godwin's mouth went dry. Christ help me, Godwin thought, and felt the sweat on his spear shaft as the distance between them closed to less than a single furlong. That's one big, ugly bastard.
How good's your Anglo-Saxon?
Not bad.
See, I pulled up the Lord's Prayer in Anglo-Saxon.
Oh, okay.
Can you read the first line? It's probably your pronunciation is probably better than
Yeah,
mine.
let me give it a go.
So this is what the English of the time actually sounded like.
Father o the iatun hiophanum, si thin nama gehalgud, to become a thin riche, ge worth a thin willa, and iorthon swa on hiophanum. I could
That'll
go
do.
on.
Yeah. But you know that you can get little bits of that might be English, but
Yeah, it kind of sends a bit of a shiver down my spine when I hear people speaking Old English, because it's something that it feels that you almost should be able to understand it. And it kind of wavers on the edge of being understood, and I love that kind of feeling.
But it's really different still.
Yeah, very different. Although once you start to work out just some of the basic rules of how English changed between Old English and Middle English, or Modern English, then it becomes much more transparent, honest.
I think we'll open it up for questions from the floor, if you have any. We have about another half hour or so, I think.
Before the Vikings break through the roof.
That's right. Well, while people are thinking of them, well, you're talking about research. There was something I read on the BBC, I think just yesterday, or Scientific American. They were studying armor. They dressed some poor people up in a full suit of armor and put them on a treadmill to see how they would do it. The conclusion was it's really tiring. But the one sort of thing they learned, which might have helped inform your book, is that apparently you had to breathe shallow and fast.
Yeah, but this was about the Battle of Agincourt, wasn't it?
Oh, I don't know. I think they just dressed people up in full suits of armor and put them in the gym. And
Yeah, well, I was listening to the same piece, and we're talking about Agincourt, where they wore kind of full armor from head to toe, and actually saying that actually modern soldiers carry a similar weight, but it's kind of on their back, which makes it much easier to carry. And the kind of the effort of swinging your legs when your legs weigh an extra 10 kilos each can be quite exhausting. Yeah, so there was all that. I have a friend in Discovery Bay whose son is into reenactment groups. So these are groups in England who dress up in kind of Viking armor or Roman armor, and they do kind of battles. They go to old battle sites and kind of act out the battles. And he was very keen for me to go and join his reenactment group in England. And I was quite tempted, but I didn't manage to get the time. But I think it's fascinating to see kind of how much chainmail armor would weigh, and then to go and fight, for hours, in battle. Quite extraordinary. But I think there was a study on, because people live much more physical lives. I think someone worked out that an average Viking would need about 5,000 calories a day, because he's chopping wood, he's killing sheep, skinning sheep, carrying water, all this kind of stuff.
Pillaging and sacking.
All that. I love, and this is again something I find fascinating. Is I don't know how many people get seasick, but I get seasick the minute I look at water, and thinking about kind of Vikings who sail over from Norway across the North Sea. No wonder they were in such a bad mood, because these ships are open, cold, places, and just the thought of being seasick for 3 days straight in the North Sea with kind of the cold wind blowing. Kind of no wonder they were very aggressive. Anyway.
Yeah. Here's a question here.
Thank you. Sorry, I got a sore throat. My voice is very low today, so I apologize. And I would like to have a question, because today's topic is talking about history. So I would like to ask you, do you think your fiction is popular among teenagers? Do they like to read historical fictions? And do you think that historical fictions, if the teenager read more historical fictions, they will have more understanding about history, and also they will have more interest to learn more about history, to encourage them to have a interest to understand history, and having at least a better historical knowledge. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think so, and I hope so. And certainly, from my experience, when I was a teenager, I was reading, kind of Alfred Duggan and Rosemary Sutcliffe, and finding out about history through these stories, as well as kind of television. Yeah, and it's funny you ask about teenagers, because something I've never really believed in is kind of teen fiction. Because when I was a teenager, the last thing I wanted to read was teen fiction. I wanted to read real fiction. I wanted to read the stuff my dad was reading. And so, I hope so. And I know from my, experience, I was fascinated by Vikings and, this kind of period as a youth. And I read, Henry Treece, all these kinds of books. And I would be delighted if my books kind of gave someone else an enthusiasm for this period. And it's quite interesting. As a writer, I used to joke about when you're being a writer, do you write about, say, sex or swear words? Do you put them in? And I used to joke about my mother is going to read this syndrome, which kind of terrifies a lot of writers. Thinking my mother's going to read this. What can I tell the truth or not? And actually, I'd kind of got past that. But then I saw my son, who had just gone to school, and I thought, oh no, I now have my son is going to read this syndrome. And so actually, I went through it, and I took all the sex out. There wasn't much sex anyway, but I took it out. And
there wasn't much sex in the book or in the Anglo-Saxon period?
Yeah, well, it must have been the Anglo-Saxon period. But yeah, in the book, all the sex went. And I took out all the swear words, because I thought, I can't have my son reading a book that I've written with swear words in it.
But this is a lot, almost comic books or movies. There's a movie just about Thor just came out, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is all, essentially, he's in there, isn't he? And this is the stuff teenagers like to go to the movies and watch, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Teenagers. I say this is kind of action book. The book has been much longer, but I had to kind of cut it back, and so it's ended up what I hope is quite a fast read, and I think that is probably good for teens, in that the pace of the story. I hope it's a page turner, and so I think that's a kind of a good thing. Yeah.
Lots of swords and battle axes and that sorts of things.
Battles, I remember watching Avatar, the film, and thinking, it's great to kill all your characters in the last battle, or kind of frighten the reader, because it makes, I know from books I really enjoy reading, it's kind of when you fear for your characters, they're going into a situation and you're nervous for them, and hopefully in this book, you feel for Godwin and the other characters in the story, and it makes for kind of a very exciting book, I think.
I'm going to ask another question. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll just keep on it. There's one there. Otherwise, I'll just keep on asking questions. I got a whole page full of them, and I get to go first. So if you don't raise your hand, you won't get a chance.
Has any of your books been optioned to be made into films? And if the answer is yes, what will be your first concern?
No. The Drink and Dream Teahouse, my novel that was set in modern China, had a lot of people interested, and from working titles as a big British company to the US films, studios were looking to do a Chinese language film, and this was about 6 years ago. So no one optioned it in the end. But I hope, we live in a very kind of strange world actually, where best-selling books are often decided by which ones are made into films or not. And as I think this is a great book and I want it to sell, obviously I want it to be made into a film. But I think when you sell a book as a film, you give up. It's no longer it's not your project. Like, I don't know how to tell a story in film. I know how to tell a story in words on a page. And so I guess you just hope that they, if it happens, then they put together a good team to make it into a good film. I think, one of the best adaptations I remember is The English Patient, where I thought actually I thought the film was better than the book in many ways. And I think, I would hope, that something like that happens, that actually they do something interesting with it. And actually that might mean straying from the story or changing the story slightly, because you are telling it in a very different medium. And I think it's interesting how I really feel, I've been published now about 15 years, and I think the publishing industry has changed quite a lot. And I think one of the big influences on the way we read and write stories is television and film. I think it has really changed the way people think and expect a story, or how long they will give a story before they think, this is boring, I'm going to put it down. I hear this a lot in the publishing houses. And I don't know if it's a good change or not a good change, but it's a challenge for a writer to write books that people will. I want you to put down a book and say, hand it to the person next to you and say, this is fabulous, you've got to read it. And so I think that's kind of a challenge now.
Kindles. What's your view on paper books versus electronic books?
Yeah, I dismissed Kindles until about a year ago when at the City University of Hong Kong we have an MFA in creative writing, and lots of our students turned up with Kindles and ebooks and iPads, and I suddenly saw, wow, actually they do look great. You can read off them. And some people, people kind of always bemoan change, and I'm not a bemoaner. I kind of think, well, deal with it. And when television came, people said that's the end of radio, and we still have radio. And so I think it's definitely a change, and I think the publishing industry is going to change quite a lot in the next few years. But I think it's also an opportunity, because the publishing industry is kind of quite a stranglehold on what gets published. So new books will be published, books that maybe wouldn't be economic as printed books will get published as ebooks. For me as a writer, it's a great way to get my backlist into print, because it's very easy to have it as a download. And I think what it's going to happen is probably the ebook is going to replace mass market paperbacks to some extent. I don't think it's going to replace hardbacks. I still think people are going to want books in their rooms, in their living space. When I walk into a house and there's no books, I feel there's something missing. And, I love walking in someone's house and looking at their bookshelves and just seeing what they kind of display about themselves. And I love books as objects as well. So I think, it's definitely going to change publishing, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for writers, actually. And being able to self-publish, I have things that I would love to make books out of, but I would never get published through the conventional media. Whereas now there's lots of ways of getting small books or kind of chapbooks that I think would be very interesting and fun for me to write, and get them published either as ebooks or as kind of print on demand, which is also the big change that's happening.
In front here. Is there a microphone coming up front here?
At the front.
At the front.
Yeah, Mr. Hill, when you're writing a chapter about a specific historical background or scenery, do you check or searching the accuracy of the actual fact, or are you using your imagination for that part? Thank you.
So I start off always with checking the actual place. This book has taken me 5 years to write, and I spent the first year just doing solid research. And the reason it took me so long is I kept realizing there's stuff I didn't know that I needed to know, which could be, what kind of buttons did they use? What if you walked into a room? What would the room look like? What would you sit down upon? If there was a table, what would be on the table? What kind of personal objects would you have in your pocket? The idea of what would you sit down upon? Would you sit on a bench or a stool or a chair? And actually chairs were very high status symbols. So an incredible amount of checking details. And then a kind of, of working out, does that actually need to be in the story? Is that important? Because actually the story, because I'm not writing an encyclopedia of Anglo-Saxon England. I'm writing a story, and the story is through a character's point of view, and it's through Godwin's point of view. So actually, if you were at a demonstration or, some kind of big event, you might not see everything that's happening. And so you just see your kind of point of view. And so I was thinking, okay, this is everything that's happening, or this is what the place looks like, but actually, what would the character experience? And I think this is the difference with historical fiction, is that you're approaching a story through a character's point of view, and through their eyes, and through their experience. And so it's a combination of imagination and lots and lots of research.
Is it easier to write, because we don't know that much about Godwin, really. You know much more about some of the other people, Queen Emma or Ethelred. Is it easier to write about a character for whom actually less is known, or is it easier to write about someone about more is known?
I think it's easier to write about someone that we know less about. And actually it's more exciting that way, because it gives you more opportunity, gives you more freedom, more opportunity to kind of to make that character up. I mean, because again, I was talking about kind of the experience of writing is that, you spend hours, I spent 5 years with Godwin, and I really like him as a character. I think, quite extraordinary kind of events he lived through. And I miss, I've started the next book now, and I miss not writing about Godwin. And that's partly because I could really kind of make him up and use my experiences. He grows up in an England that's in what appears to be terminal decline, an England where there's Vikings are invading every few years, and they're burning houses, they're stealing money, they're killing cattle, and so actually that reminded me quite a lot of growing up in Yorkshire, during the 80s in England, where Yorkshire was kind of in terminal decline. The steel works were closing, the coal mines were closing, all the kind of the great things about Yorkshire industry were closing, and so all that kind of stuff I can bring my own experiences and memories into Godwin as a character.
Question here.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Two questions. The first question is, obviously, what you're writing in some sort of so-called, maybe non-fictional novel, you have sort of really referring to some true historical events. And then you have got this genre. You've got, I've read, The Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And then you have got the other type of books which are purported to be true historical accounts, like biographies, say, for example. And then in your case, you could actually dream up some dialogues. But in those, what we may call real biographies or whatever, they have some of those things also got fairly sort of vivid dialogue, so to speak, in quotation marks. So is there sort of difference, or from your point of view, or maybe it's not fair to you, that those between you and those historians, so to speak? And then the other question is to follow on from about your observations about the use of swear words. Now, I see that those middle market newspapers like Daily Mail or even The Sun, when they have the F word, they use F star star star. But in truly upmarket publications, posh ones like Financial Times, they actually print FUCK in full. I mean, just a bit. Is it just those Daily Mail or those The Sun like petite bourgeois? While those truly upmarket publications, I mean, they don't give a damn about it. Thank you.
I don't know about the newspapers, but the idea of histories, or the kind of the differences between historical fiction and biography and things. I think one of the differences is what you expect from a book, and obviously with a biography, you're expecting something quite different than if you're reading historical fiction, and again, quite different if you're reading, kind of historical, historical kind of novelized fiction. I mean, history. I think it's quite interesting. I think people are playing with the genres much more now. Like Humphrey Carpenter, he was one of the first biographers to kind of fictionalize days. He would kind of say, let's imagine a day in the life of this character, and he would kind of make it all up. Which at that point, kind of the 80s, people thought was dreadful that you would make stuff up in a biography. But actually, I found as a writer, my first books were, my first book was true to the point of, it all happened exactly as I reported it. But actually, I found moving from non-fiction, creative non-fiction, into fiction, actually with fiction in many ways, you can get much closer to the truth than you can in writing non-fiction. That's quite, I can go on about that at length, but I won't, unless anyone asks me to. There we go. So I'll tell you, I'll make it very brief. When I went to China, I went to mainland China, small town China in '93, and the books, I read all the books I could find, and there was about 5 of them. And there was still a kind of very prevalent idea of kind of the Chinese being inscrutable. And, I went to China, and I didn't find people at all inscrutable. In fact, I find them very easy to understand. And once you kind of learnt Chinese culture and customs and language, very straightforward. And I thought someone has to write a better book about China than the ones I'd read. And so I tried to write a book about the town I lived in, and it was all true and kind of accurate and everything. But I found the very odd thing with travel writing, and this is kind of a problem with travel writing, is that it turns the locals into foreigners. Because I'm an Englishman in China reporting everything I see and kind of things I think are interesting. And so all the Chinese people become foreigners in their own country. And they're kind of reduced to kind of romantic or pathetic or heroic characters. And it really irritated me. And I thought, this book has not done what I wanted it to do. So then the next book I wrote about China, I wrote a novel, The Drink and Dream Teahouse. And still, Western writers, when they write about China, they always put a Western character in the novel, as if you can't understand China or the Chinese unless you have a Westerner holding your hand, doing that same thing of turning all the Chinese into foreigners. And that really irritated me. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to write a book about Shaoyang in Hunan province, and there's going to be no Westerners, and you'll never see a Westerner. People won't talk about Westerners, because this is a book about China and kind of modern China and what's happening in China. And so in that way, the whole kind of idea of inscrutability becomes a non-issue, because you're in the head of the Chinese characters and you're understanding, and this is why I talked about kind of writing it, trying to bring kind of the Chinese way of seeing the world and interacting with each other into the English of you're in the heads of Chinese characters who are talking to each other kind of in Chinese. And so you're immediately, for a Western reader, you're immediately kind of in China in a way that non-fiction couldn't bring you. And that's what's the magical things about fiction, is it brings you into the character, it brings you into the experience in a much more immediate way than kind of non-fiction writing. There you go. That was pretty good. Yeah. A couple of minutes. There you go. Good. I hope that makes sense.
Question at the back.
Mr. Hill, this question, hopefully it's a fair one to address with you. As a person who's a writer who's been writing about bringing history into life and almost bringing characters in the past like Godwin to life, what do you think of an author's responsibility to address which parts of the novel may be creative and which parts may be taking certain license and other parts that are non-fictional? I use two examples so you see where I'm coming from. One would be Mary Beard's book about Pompeii, which is acclaimed for its factual substance. The other end would be something that I enjoyed very much, but I had my doubts about, something like the Da Vinci Code, for example. It has a disclaimer in the front that says most of these things, if not all of these things, are true. So I don't know which ones are not, so if you could.
You know, that's an excellent question. And I approach it, what would I like as a reader? And I like, as a reader, at the end of the book, not before the book, because I don't want to spoil the experience of, kind of reading it. At the end of the book, to kind of know which bits are true and which bits are not true, like which characters are real, which ones are not real, and kind of what bits are real, made up, etc., and which bits are guesswork, and which bits are kind of intuition. And so, as a writer, at the end of the book, I have a kind of a fairly brief author's note that kind of covers some of the basics, really. I mean, I could probably write almost as long a book about, the whole process of, which bits are true and not true and which bits are imagined or not. But just kind of basically setting out, almost as a teaser for the reader, because I think, again, where historical fiction is fabulous is that you might end a book like this, having really enjoyed it, and be teased by the author's note saying, these people are real, these events are real, other bits I made up, and I made them up like this because of, whatever reason. And then that's a springboard, really, to again go and find out the real history, to pick up a history book, and then go and, find out for yourself, having been inspired and excited by history. I think history is incredibly interesting, and all kinds of great stories. No wonder, writers like Shakespeare, even in Chinese classics, we didn't really talk about the Chinese, but, the kind of romance, the three kingdoms, all kinds of, peoples tell their... We fix ourselves in the modern world often through the history or the myths we tell ourselves about kind of, our country or our families. And so history, I think, is incredibly important. Of defining and redefining ourselves, in the modern world. And probably more now than ever, because so much is changing in the world around us.
You brought up Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Sometimes our views of Cleopatra, for example, actually come from Shakespeare. It wasn't really very accurate at all.
Yeah.
I mean, there is that danger, isn't there, that people can become fixated on the fictional version of reality rather than the real version.
Shakespeare probably wouldn't do very well now on historical accuracy. Reviewers would go to town on Shakespeare as being a kind of sycophantic, writer. So I think now is almost kind of, quite interesting kind of golden age, because there are so many writers, I think, who are trying to. We know so much more. We have more access to material and sources, and a lot of writers who are trying to keep very close to the truth, as well as writing very good stories.
Time for one or two more questions. Are there more? There's one here.
So, excuse me, can I follow up the previous questions? You have talked about that you do not like to, you have said that you think to write about stories that less people knows, write about something that we are not very familiar with, it is better, it's more exciting. But as you know, that the situation of students learning history in Hong Kong is awful, we can say. They don't like history, they hate history, and just want to get a textbook and then finishing the exam just throw away.
I think that's not just true in Hong Kong. I think it's a problem with students around the world.
Yeah, so do you have an idea of writing about something which is more common, like Asian romance, like Asian Greek, which can, just like you have said, the historical fiction actually can help students to learn history. So would you have an idea to write about more common history, like the World Wars, which can I think students will be more interested in those stories, and I think it will help them learning history more. So do you have this idea?
Which bits of history are you studying, and which ones are the most boring?
I would say it is about the Dark Ages and also about the ancient times, since very less information.
Okay. I think ancient times, there's lots of books. And Romans, it's funny, someone said to me, do you think they'll make a film out of this? And I said, you know what? The Anglo-Saxons are not very cool. You know, they have moustaches, for one thing, and you can't dress them, you know, kind of like 300. You know, you can't show their legs off. You know, you can't they don't wear sexy clothing. They wore trousers and cloaks, and they had long hair and moustaches. You know, they're much too hairy. You can't kind of do a 300 on them, and you know, pecs and abs and everything. So I think the classical, there's lots of writers, you know, in the kind of classical period, and Dark Ages. Well, you know, this might, you know, enliven the Dark Ages a little bit. Yeah, but I think for me, writing about the history, I like periods that, or stories that no one really knows about. I think that's quite exciting. And what was I going to say? Yeah, I can't remember now. Never mind.
Leading on from that, I've read that this is part of a trilogy, and you know the book's got fabulous reviews. So could you share a little bit about what you're planning to write about in the next two?
Yeah, the next two. The next one is Godwin's son. It's his story. And so it's Harold. It's the guy who gets the arrow in his eye. It's Harold Godwinson. It's his story. You know, I said a trilogy, partly because I was very inspired by Lord of the Rings and to kind of start writing in the first place. And so, I thought this would be my homage to Tolkien. And it's changed, you know, vastly since then. Probably for the best, actually. But actually, I could see 5 books quite easily about this period, and each telling one character's view of one character's story. And often, I don't know if anyone's read the Alexandria Quartet by Alexander Durrell. Just a fabulous books, and they're 4 books that cover the same period of Alexandria, kind of in the 1930s and the Second World War. And each one is Justin, Chloe, Balthazar, and I can't remember the last one. And they're all the same events told from different characters' points of view. And I've always thought that is fabulous. I would love to do that, or something like that. And I had thought about doing it about this town in Shaoyang in Hunan that I've written about. But actually, I think maybe this would be quite a good way of doing that, of approaching this period from different characters' points of view, and telling their story. I think that'll be, you know, so I could see actually 5 books, but we'll see how successful, how long I stay excited by it, and how long the readers stay excited by it, to see how many books I'll write. Because I'm starting to get ideas for Hong Kong. I don't know if Timothy Moe has kind of famously said, you know, Hong Kong is the graveyard for English novelists. Which I think, okay, that's a challenge. I don't think there's been a really good kind of English writer write about Hong Kong yet. So, I like a challenge. So maybe I'll write about Hong Kong in the future.
You have a lot of history to get through first, don't you?
Yeah. Maybe, you know.
There are books that can be signed, so we'll leave some time for that now. Please join me in thanking Justin for coming all the way from Discovery Bay.
Thank you.